And if there's anything that I've learned about Indigenous communities is that we take gifting very seriously. We will not be outgifted. A Haida friend of mine was like, "You'll never outgift a Haida," and I was like, "You want to bet?" Right? And I left
That event with my suitcase like way overweight, and like, God bless the Air Canada lady who kind of just,
taken up by everyone.
well, I think that they are starting to. I think there's just such a misunderstanding of who our communities are, and that we're still here, and that, if you want adaptation experts, you really should come to us for the answers, right? So I feel a lot of hope now. There's more and more interest in our knowledges and our worldviews to inform or provide a grander picture, because we should be further ahead than we are. And maybe it's just having more contributions by different worldviews and perspectives that are going to help complete the picture. So I think we're almost there.
Is there an example that you can provide where food security is concerned?
In terms, no one really knows what to do. And so everyone's like, well, we need to kind of put things back the way they are, and like Indigenous communities are like, wait a minute, this is food systems collapse. Not just traditional food systems, but agrarian food systems as well. This is a ranching area. So we need to lens to the whole recovery effort. Whereas before it was about, well, we got to put these trees back and dump this seed and all that, but it wasn't this food systems lens. And when I started to talk about that, in our multi-stakeholder gatherings, there's like, holy smokes, you're right. This is the collapse of food systems. And if we think about it that way, we're going to make sure everybody is tended to. Like, what about the food systems for the bears? What about the food systems for the deer, both traditionally as well?
That's great. Thank you so much, Jennifer. Patrick, last but not least, 7 minutes, please.
Thank you. And again, great pleasure to be here with you.
Literal fear that they won't be able to put food on the table next week. There's a serious problem here, structural problem. You use the word food systems collapse. And that's what it comes down to. So what I'm putting on the table is that food insecurity is all the things that have been said so far, but I'm put it in this bigger picture of food systems collapse, or put it on a positive sense, food systems transformation. Why is that? Well, where we are relying, the system we 70, 80, and then work backwards to figure out what on earth.
Food systems that generate 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions. And it's not just from agriculture, by the way, Evan. It's the whole food system. It's the transportation, the refrigeration, everything else that goes along the food system.
Transformation. And a year ago, the Prime Minister of Nepal was quoted as saying, and I quote, "Transforming our food systems is akin to..."
Through, you'd have the lovely gaggle of children coming out, beautiful children, rushing out, and every single one of them had either a bag of chips or a bag of cookies, salted cookies, or a beverage. It doesn't matter which sugar-sweetened beverage it is. One of them, that's what they were carrying. One of them, that's what they were carrying. Now, I'm not bemoaning ultra-processed foods. I'm not going to go into that. But the point is, the system allows those products to reach the most remote parts of the world you can imagine. That's vertically. It's the same horizontally. But, as Evan said, there are not enough fruits and veg produced food-based dietary guidelines. So the system isn't fit for purpose. It has to change. We have to think about what comes next. Where do we go in the future? And there are many ways to be positive about that future.
Thank you very much, Patrick. What you're describing, reinventing a global food system, as you say, building a fortress, is another process that is long-term thinking what's required here. And as you know, as we discussed earlier, most governments are not naturals at doing this.
Yeah.
How do you go about building that kind of interest in that long-term process in governments that are so transient?
Great question, and obviously this is an issue of political economy. My answer would be, we found that it used to be, when I first started, I worked for the CGIR, and the first place you'd go would be a prime minister or a president's office. And, you treat that as the policymaker at the highest level. You learn very
Actually, as the on the ground.
So that's the starting point. And with that in mind, I wondered if I could go to each of you again, just with a short question. If you could pick one of the other panelists' proposals as a starting point, and this isn't really a debate, it's a conversation. Where would you begin, Paul? Where would you start?
Good question. I guess I'm a little bit less willing to let capitalism and commodification off the hook. I think in this country, we have been given this thing called a right to food. Introduced in 1966, ratified 10 years later in 1976. It means that the government has a responsibility in this country to ensure that we all have access to the food that we need. So I think there's something there. I think a number of people have tried to leverage the right to food or the commitments under the right to food to push for, the kinds of interventions and the kinds of policies that we know will lead to people having access to the food that they need. So I think that's one that certainly I think is really important.
Sure. Jennifer, you had said that the answer lies with us. It's not with government. Is there I'm sure that's not a black and white statement, but.
No, and what I meant by that is that it's not, we can't leave it entirely with the government because the speed with which it works is in many cases too slow.
Yeah.
And so in the meantime, I would hope that we could action ourselves, like, recognizing even in our own way of life and behaviors every day that we could be working harder at building community and getting to know people enough that some support that we may be able to offer them.
Sure. So maybe just staying with you, where would you go, having heard the proposals that your colleagues have made, where would you go kind of as a starting point?
Well, I think data is incredibly important, and something I talk a lot about in my research is that we need to bring the tools together for the benefit of all. And, there's so much power in the specificity of the data that we can get now, where these sort of cookie-cutter blanket approaches over landscapes, they don't work. A greater level of specificity within communities, we can get those localized results that we're looking for and empower people, in that. So, yeah.
And well, one of the concerns that comes up always with data are privacy concerns and how much data, how much do we know about everybody's actions? How do you deal with those questions?
Those are questions that come up all the time. I think one thing that I didn't say about satellite data in particular, we have lots and lots of free and open satellite data. And a lot of these satellites that are being put up to space, whether it's from the Canadian Space Agency, the European NASA, are all free and open. And I think for the purpose of aiding and providing more transparency, of course, then there are the questions about, well, how much information do you have about my specific farm? And I think those are really important dialogues about how do we use these data. And not only, I think we're seeing more and more increase in a lot of technology and tools, whether it's AI and cloud computing and the convergence of all these information. And I think it's not only data, but it's being honest about what the data is and giving the uncertainties around.
Important for a number of reasons. I want to pick up on a couple of pieces. The first was around government slowness. I think we all need to reject this. I think we just need to go back a little while to the CERB. The CERB came out very, very quickly. When government prioritizes something and sees it as something urgent, they will move quickly.
You mean the payments that were given out during COVID?
Exactly. So I think governments convince us that they can be slow, but again, they prioritize things when they need to. I think the question of data is really important and what data we look at, because in this country, for example, when we look at the data around poverty, it tells a wonderful story, and we have members of parliament, government officials of every ilk, speaking about the incredible impacts that we're having around reducing poverty. But actually, poverty is some arbitrary, the measure is quite arbitrary. I think the thing that's really important about food insecurity data is it speaks to people's lived experience, and that is going a very different direction than the data around poverty. So yes, data is super key, and being critical and interrogating it and understanding where that data is coming from and who's asking the questions and for what purpose, I think is critical.
Nala, can I just push back just a little bit?
Absolutely. And please don't wait for me. Jump in. Any of you, please. Go ahead.
You know, it's not about letting government off the hook when we characterize it as slow, but our communities have suffered for many, many years waiting for the government to do something. And so I think it's about empowering ourselves to do something in the meantime. And like, yes, when government's motivated, they can answer quickly, but then we're relying on them to prioritize what's affecting us in our day-to-day lives.
Yeah.
And so I think it's like, you know, there's not one silver bullet here, but it's like, what are we doing while we're waiting for them? And like, I sit with elders all the time, and they're like, they're done waiting.
Right.
They're like, you just got to go. You just got to do this. Yeah.
Patrick, just your thoughts. We'll go back to the round of questions, but your thoughts on, as you're listening to this conversation about government, because you must see examples of this around the world.
Absolutely, but let me respond again on data. I think
Sure.
Absolutely, data are essential, but increasingly I find that we need the appropriate data that supports a clear narrative, right? Not just points of statistics, which speaks to the difference between poverty and food insecurity. They're very different measures. They overlap, but they're very different. As we move towards a food systems transformation, hopefully, then it's not that we need more data, new data, but what we do need is information that helps tell the story, that things are moving in the right direction, that things are being done. And some of those may relate to governance, for example, and governments. What are governments do or not? What are they doing or not? In terms of putting in legislation into practice, or enabling certain policies to be seen on the ground at a certain time, right? That's very different from how many documents have you signed at top. And the other end is different numbers about not just the cost per metric ton of corn, but the cost per 100 calories of different kinds of foods that are produced that can help us better understand what is affordable or not to different people, right? Still statistics, but a very different narrative associated.
Yeah. Did you want to also make a comment when you recall what we've talked about so far about where to begin? Let's imagine, even though government isn't maybe our first priority, that we're writing a white paper for a government. Where would you begin in radically changing the picture of food security?
At this point, I put most of my efforts in trying to connect dots.
Yeah.
So given that climate change is so directly linked to food systems, ensuring better integration of diets and food systems into the COP process and the climate change agenda. But the same applies to the human justice agenda, which doesn't always think about food systems as a priority entry point. Same thing, the human health. The public health practitioners don't always think about food. In fact, they rarely think about nutrition. But given that poor diets are such a major underpinning of poor human health, which is crippling health budgets in many countries around the world, there are linkages there. So in a sense, trying to use food insecurity, dietary patterns, as the linchpin that enables us to tell this narrative and show how these things are all connected. And it is one of the few common things we all eat. At least, 5 times a day, Evan, maybe. But, so, some not even once a day, but we all have to eat. And bringing that to the core of the discussion humanizes it, but also makes it possible to link to these other systems thinking that need to be done.
And Bill, what would be your answer to that, having heard what your colleagues said?
And I think it's around, I agree with what's been said. I think it's around asking the right questions, making sure that when you're developing the data, collecting the data, it is with that purpose and in an honest way, and converting that data into information. And I think that's where a lot of the challenges are, is we have loads of data, but how do you actually transfer that into information, into the hands of those that need that in order to make decisions? And I think that's really critical for everything that we're saying.
Were you going to add something?
Yeah, I just, as we're talking about data, I have to come back to, I want to introduce another point,
Sure.
So I'm in this space with all of you that, let's be frank, is predominantly white. It's diverse, but predominantly white. And I think that's one of the things that we have to challenge, in solution-finding spaces and how we take the data. I was a part of this project with Proof, Proof out of the University of Toronto, that looked at data that has existed for a long time, but actually disaggregated race-based data and found, very, very different experiences for Black Canadian households versus, the kind of aggregate data that is routinely reported out on and commented on. Black households are 3.5 times more likely to experience food insecurity. We know that, the kind of narrative around food insecurity in this country that is based on aggregate data suggests that if someone lives in a single-parent household, they're more likely to experience food insecurity. Well, of course, but actually not of course, because for Black Canadians, the risk and prevalence for food insecurity remains high, regardless of how many parents are in the household. The protection that I talked about for seniors doesn't exist for Black Canadians. So I think there's a really important need for disaggregated race-based data and to also prioritize those who have had to bear the brunt of the inequities associated with food insecurity, to not only lead, but to be resourced to lead in the solution-finding spaces.
I want to make sure we leave time for audience questions, but I do want to ask you this. As people who are working in different areas, but all on a topic that affects so many of us, how do you begin to make sure that the message is coherent, that these different parts of thinking
of food insecurity are constantly evolving, and the high-level panel of experts that Evan has just been just joining in Rome has just recently expanded the definition of food insecurity to include not just availability and affordability, but agency and sustainability. And I think a lot of other people were already using those terms before it got codified, if you like, at a UN level. So it's not that there needs to be one place where everything is agreed. I think we're doing well. I think we just need to build on our collective enthusiasm, outrage, and energy to reach diverse audiences. That's my view.
I know we want to talk about solutions, but I do want to have a very quick answer from each of you and Paul, back to you, of what's the cost of not acting urgently on the question of food insecurity?
It'll continue to increase. We will continue to have families across this country and parents across this country looking in their kids' eyes and not knowing whether or not they can feed them. And that, to me, is horrific. We're here in Toronto, in one of the richest countries in the world, richest province, richest city. Certainly, we should be leading with demonstrating what it means to care for one another and ensure that the youngest among us have access to food, all of us have access to food.
And Paul?
I think we can't afford not to. I think we are in unparalleled territory in terms of food insecurity, locally to globally, and I think we recognize that, and we have to move, and we have to move quickly. It's urgent.
Jen?
Well, I think it's just not being treated like the emergency that it is. And I think that those of us that belong to groups who have been disproportionately affected by it, it's very frustrating that it's taking this long for the rest of the world to wake up to it. And so I think, we need to see more of us in these interdisciplinary storytelling roles leading that discussion to make sure the right questions get asked and the right interpretation of the data, happens. Yeah.
And Patrick?
The estimated costs of putting food systems transformation into place are, anyone's guess, but let's say 300 billion a year. A lot of money, but hey, not all that much compared to the whole world economy. The cost of doing nothing and being forced to act 30 years from now, when our planet is burning and everything that we see today you can ramp up 20-fold, is going to be trillions. Yeah. And there doesn't seem to be the urgency to take this on yet. So So we have to be making this clear to more people.
On that very sobering note, thank you to all of you. And opening up to questions to any of you. I think there's a microphone, someone with a microphone. Oh, person right here with a microphone. Just put your hand up and she'll come to you if you have a question for any of the panelists. I see a question back at the right there. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, sorry about that. Thank you very much. That was an excellent way to kick off the day. I wanted to build on this last question about the true cost of not acting. And Patrick, to your point, I think the estimate is 12 trillion is the current cost of our food system in terms of health outcomes, climate outcomes, loss of livelihood along the food value chain. The Food and Agriculture Organization just brought out a report, The State of Food and Agriculture, I believe it was last week, and it is on this question of the true cost. I'm wondering, with increasing information and data on the true cost, how do we get that into the hands of the policymakers, and how do we use that information to drive change?
Is that to Patrick or to
anyone who wants?
Patrick, we'll start with you.
Thanks for that. Very, very important but very challenging question, because it's simpler, in a way, it seems simpler than it is. There are still many ways of measuring, let's say, the true cost of food, where it's not just the price you pay in the supermarket, but the externalities, the costs involved in carbon emissions, in terms of heat loss, in terms of refrigeration use, and so on, right? And all the way back through to labor exploitation. You know, if you factor everything that went into producing an apple, the cost of that apple, let's say at 50 cents, would probably be, in fact, $3, right, instead of 50 cents. The challenge is who bears those costs. Right now, they're largely invisible. The consumer pays a chunk of it. The producer gets a very little of it. But the costs are borne along a very long value chain, and that still needs to be unpackaged. But it's not just unpackaging. And we haven't really talked much about the private sector here. A lot of what goes on between farm and fork is private sector business. And enhancing the efficiency of what they do and getting them on board to produce the healthiest of products, not just the most profitable of products, is a perennial challenge, right? So I won't go on, keep going in that space. We need to better understand the costs of doing everything. Food is one of those. But then ascribing responsibility for bearing that cost is going to be one of our biggest challenges going in the next decade.
Do you want to tackle that, Paul? Yeah?
I'm going to come at this a little bit differently,
Sure.
but maybe not so differently. I think, so driving change, the questions around driving change as governments come and go, this sort of thing. Well, I think about solidarity, and I think about how so much has changed in the last 40, 50 years. We used to care about each other. I hate to be so crass, but I don't think we do in the same way. We used to actually sit over the fence and talk to our neighbor. Now we race from our vehicle, we race into our units, and we don't want to talk to anybody. You ever hear that button at the elevator? If you live in a condo, closed door, closed door. That's the reality of where we're at. So I think before, in order to advance the kind of change that we need, we've got to also be building solidarity, and we've got to be thinking about how do we move away from these transactional types of interactions that have become so commonplace to more relational type organizing, building relationships, because I think then we can start to care about and advocate for those that are being left behind and actually put some skin in the game in terms of ensuring that folks are no longer left behind. And I also think, one of the things that gets in the way of our ability to do that is we are so busy. We are trying to stay alive. We're trying to find childcare. We're trying to find housing. We're trying to find affordable medicine. So I think, again, in one of the richest countries in the world, if we could commit to a framework that advances a decent quality of life, that includes things perhaps like a basic income, perhaps, affordable childcare, building the affordable housing that we need, pharmacare, these are the sorts of things that I think will give us the kind of time to maybe not be pushing that elevator button and wanting to engage with our neighbor and wanting to advance the kind of change to ensure that no one's left behind.
Okay, thank you. Is there another question in the audience? There are two back there, I think. Yeah? Maybe we'll try, we only have about 7 more minutes. We'll try to get through as many as possible. So with that in mind, please go ahead.
Okay, hi. Thank you, all of you, and thank you to the Arrell Food Institute for this conference. My name's Jeff Nankerville. I'm the CEO of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, which is a national public institution with a mandate to promote understanding and awareness and engagement between Canada and Asia. And in February, we'll be convening a major Canada-Asia agri-food conference in Singapore. Happy, and my colleague Jordan Dupuy is here also. We're happy to talk to folks about it. My question is about the role of international exchanges in all of this. And I say exchanges, it's a broad term. Trade, international trade is essential in the global food system. And Canadians derive a portion of their prosperity from our country's participation in international trade, not only in commodities, but also in knowledge, in innovation, in technological service offerings, and so on. And it'd be interesting to hear from the panelists about the role that international networks play, also at the NGO level. I think a very fundamental point that came out is governments come and go, but it's these large grassroots movements, and we see them in places in Asia, like in Bangladesh, for example, that have a huge role to play. So what about the role of international networks and exchanges in the work that you're doing here?
Thank you. Is there someone who wants to tackle that?
I can have our perspective. I would say that we as an organization wouldn't exist without having this international network, and I think the way we grew out is recognizing that the needs that, in our case it was the US government looking at how do you better utilize this kind of information, how do you improve the ministry's information, was looking at what were other people around the world doing. And so we started as a community, it was a grassroots in a way, like looking at many different countries that evolved into a G20 initiative called GeoGlam, and that was the basis actually for also starting NASA Harvest, which is NASA's Global Food Security and Agriculture Program. And I would say we learn a lot from each other, and I can give an example from Canada. And so Canada is the first country that replaced one of its critical agricultural surveys, the September survey, with satellite data. And that removes a burden from farmers. That has actually also increased the accuracy. And that's been a model for other countries to look at and to emulate and to understand how did one country do it, how do we do this in another. So I think those are absolutely critical for many reasons. Our food system is interconnected, it is global. We're all changing similar challenges in some cases, others in not, but having that international forum to come together is absolutely key.
In the interest of time, I'm going to keep going unless anyone's burning to add more, okay? Where are we right now? Please, go ahead.
Thank you. And I think that what we've heard from every single panel member tells us about the need to work together. There isn't one single solution to everything. But what came to mind as I was listening and learning is the importance of knowledge dissemination. And that includes knowledge that references disaggregated data and the impact, the varying impacts on populations and how that should influence policymaking. I also thought about food security and national security and whether we need to define national security more broadly. I think, for example, the mention of health, and when you mentioned diet, Patrick, I thought, oh geez, no, he's going to tell me to eat less. But I also have experienced what you talked about in terms of access to bad food, sugar-loaded diets. okay? And I think about the impact of that, poverty and low quality food on health, like diabetes in indigenous communities and poorer communities where access to healthy food is just out of reach. And I think that when we're challenged, we think and act differently. And the comment, the reference to COVID times, essential workers, weren't they always essential? How did they suddenly become essential? And as soon as the COVID stats seemed to have been tempered, they weren't essential anymore. They weren't being paid as if they mattered as much. So, you know, the University of Guelph, and I thank the work of the Arrell Food Institute, and I say the importance of knowledge dissemination, because policymaking and politics comes out of what policymakers and politicians understand to be the public priorities. Yeah. And therefore, the responsibility that an educational institution like the University of Guelph has to disseminate knowledge that helps to influence public awareness and public behavior cannot be underestimated. So this is as much an observation as a question, as to how we can, you know, individually go away and think about the different roles that we each can play in that regard.
So you're putting that to the panel?
I'm putting that to actually
to everyone. To everyone. It's a wonderful way, actually, to wrap up this conversation. It is an ongoing conversation. Of course, you'll be having it throughout the day, but I will throw it out to any of you who wants to make a final comment, given what was just said. Jennifer?
Well, I think when we come at this issue with really big numbers, we have a huge problem because they're not tangible. Yes. Like trillions of dollars, what does that even mean? Yeah. So I think it's about a balance of storytelling, you know, a different sort of data, honoring all these different data sets, which include capturing the stories of people in specific communities, in specific situations. And I think that then we're going to get the attention that we need on this.
Paul, last word.
Yeah, a couple of things. One, you know, we like to hold up our healthcare system in this country, our healthcare system that ends at our neck, but it's in actuality, it's a sick care system. You know, a healthcare system wouldn't be divorced from ensuring that we all have access to the food that we need. I think that's a critical point. I think the knowledge dissemination piece is really important, particularly when we have other actors trying to convince us of other things. You know, as food costs are going up, we have the government hauling out these grocery store CEOs about the cost of food, and I think this is performative and distracting. If we're going to haul out the CEO of Loblaws, which is the largest private employer in this country, we should be talking about wages, not about some of the other stuff that is what they're bound to do anyway.
Yeah. To be continued.
To be continued.
Paul, Inbal, Jennifer, and Patrick, thank you so much for sharing your insights. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Not long enough. We get to talk again.
Thank you, folks. Absolutely magnificent. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Inbal. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Nyla. The lights are changing again. So I would like now to invite Leland, Harper, Bashir Mooney, and Alice Rain up on stage. And I think we just bring the three up right now. And thank you for the enthusiastic applause. Just hold that thought for just a second. What we're going to do, folks, is just come on up and have a seat. And we're going to go to a break just now. But immediately after the break are 3 breakout sessions. The rooms are posted here. And the idea is the next session will be about engaging diverse viewpoints in discussions around food systems transformation. So what we've asked our 3 esteemed guests on stage right now is to give a 1-minute pitch as to what's going to happen in the 3 breakout sessions. So we'll do that. You can then recharge your coffee and your snacks, and then go off to the breakout rooms. Does that make sense? I'm really hoping it does. I'm getting a thumbs up from Justine. Thank you, Justine. Okay, so can I start with you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that okay?
Yes, please.
Awesome. All right, over to you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Bashir Monye. I would love for you to come and join me for my conversation around decolonizing the table. I see a lot of familiar faces, and today's conversation is going to be really around something that we haven't spoken quite yet this morning, which is the elephant in the room, both from a capitalistic structure and in the same way how colonization, both geographical and mental, it impacts every single aspect of the food and the food system. So please, 11:45, come to my floor, come to my room. There will be carpet on the floor. You'll be relaxed, laid back, and it's going to be more dialogical conversation versus the structure of somebody giving you a lecture. My name is Bashir. Come and see me in the room Kitchener for a conversation around decolonizing food and food systems. Thank you.
Bashir, food chef and educator. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Leland, professor of race and equity studies.
Yeah.
At Siena University.
Yeah. I'm Leland. I always get put against Bashir, which is unfortunate because I want to see his stuff.
Against.
There's no against, but I want to go to one of his sessions one of these days. Anyways, my session is called Breaking Barriers in Food and Agriculture, and go figure, we're talking about breaking barriers in food and agriculture. So as we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion from a range of different perspectives. So food and hospitality, agriculture, business more generally speaking, nonprofits, that kind of stuff. And we'll be talking about some tangible things that you can take back to your organizations in order to improve diversity, equity, and inclusion, what that actually means, what it looks like, and what are some tangible steps we can take to make things better for everybody, not just a select few. So come see us. We're in the Markham Vaughan room. There's going to be 4 of us, I believe. Yeah, 3 and a moderator. So yeah, we'll be walking around, doing some activities, talking about some stuff, not just talking heads at you. So come join us.
Thanks, Leland. Alice Rain, Director of Operations here at the Arrell Food Institute. Over to you.
Hi, everyone. So in this room right here, we are going to be talking and listening to people who have affected change through policy mechanisms. Many different scales, people who have used their wits, gathered their networks, made a difference through policy interventions. And you will have the chance to not only hear from them, but to talk with them in table groups. So we'll be gathering around the stage on the tables nearby, and you'll have a chance. It's an absolutely fascinating group, and I can't wait for them to meet you and for you to meet them.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alice. We now have 20 minutes for break, right, Muriel? 30. We have a 30-minute break. How luxurious. Thank you. Enjoy the networking. Thank you, everybody.